now to get started, this is a fundamental quote from Thomas Sankara. Debt is a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa aimed at subjugating its growth and development through foreign rules. Each one of us becomes a financial slave. And I want you to think about the key words here, okay? It's cleverly managed. How do we cleverly manage a contract, if not through the law? And when we speak about the law, we're speaking about rules and regulations. And if we're talking about Africa, our rules and regulations, the historicity of our rules and regulations are embedded in the colonial nature of how our tax systems have come into being. The contract law that we practice today has historical roots in colonialism. So all the contract provisions that we see that go into a debt contract today have their historical roots in these foreign rules that are a form of continued subjugation and domination of African countries. Now, there's a game that I want us to play. It's called Gamble. What I decided to do was to create a sort of a mnemonic called Gamble, right? Because every time you get a debt contract, you want to use the word gamble to say, let me identify if I can find gamble within these provisions. So what does gamble actually mean? So gamble, governed abroad. Where is this contract, the dispute resolution clause? It's New York. Why do we want New York? Why can't we say Ethiopia, Addis Ababa? That's the seat of the AU, no? Why can't we say Kenya? I mean, we're a mighty nation. I don't know if Julians will agree. Can say, anyway, let me not get into politics. But govern abroad. That's the first thing you need to look out for in a contract. Where is the dispute resolution? And is that jurisdiction friendly? New York is a tax haven. You're not going to get any friendly foreign rules from New York because New York supports capitalism. It supports consumerism. It's profit-oriented. So definitely, any legislation that is New York is extractive. That's something you need to be able to approbate and reprobate, right? So get your government to say, we're not going to have laws of the foreign country applicable to debt that is being consumed internally. Yes? Round of applause. Okay, good. The second A is accelerate the crisis. Look out for provisions in that contract that's going to accelerate crisis in your country. By this, you have to look out for provisions that simply tell you, if you make one default on a payment, be it interest payment or you're supposed to pay a penalty, if you delay by a day, an acceleration clause means the entire principal becomes due immediately. Right? What then happens to a country when the creditor is demanding the debt at this moment? You're pushing the country into insolvency, right? Somebody mentioned Sri Lanka. I think you mentioned Sri Lanka. That's what you're going to get. Then you have M, multiply defaults. This is what we call a cross-default provision, which simply means if you default on clause 1, okay, so say you've paid your principal, right? So the contract that we saw, it says you're supposed to pay your principal, you're supposed to pay your interest. But it also says you're supposed to have an escrow account, the DSSR, where you're supposed to keep your money in, the Afropetrol, right? So say, for example, in the month of March, in the 6th year of your loan period, in the month of March, you forgot, your Minister of Finance was so drunk that he forgot to now go ahead and give the directive to one of his officers to deposit money in the escrow account. That, by law, under the contract, is a default. That triggers a cross-default clause, which means because you have defaulted on that, regardless of the fact that you've been making timely payments, your entire debt now is a default and you have to pay. You go back to accelerate the crisis. So you need to look out for those problematic clauses. Then we have bleed first. What does that mean? This is where you need to think about escrow accounts and you need to think about resource-backed loans, right? Some countries do offer collateral, their natural resources. So this simply means, right, you're supposed to ensure that there's a particular percentage of money, of revenue, that you're constantly putting into an escrow account, which means the creditor is going to have access to your escrow account at any given time before the revenue in that escrow account trickles down into the national treasury. So, bleed. You can't have access to your own money because you've allowed for an escrow account into that contract. Are you feeling sad? Okay, DJ, you'll cry later. Sorry for picking on you. And then we have lock-in debt. What does this mean? So the way to protect against debt contracts is to have a collective action clause, right? So in the event a country is about to go into a debt crisis, they want to call in all their creditors and they want to tell them, please allow me to restructure. Give me some moment of reprieve where I sort out my fiscal solvency issues, and then we can get back into a new arrangement. That collective action means that if you have multiple contracts with different countries, different providers, you're bringing them into a room like this, and you're saying, allow me to restructure, because if you don't, I'll not manage to pay any of you. But if you don't have that collective action clause, it means maybe a few creditors, the vultures, the Eurobond people, the private creditors, they can simply say, we disagree. And by law, they can actually stop you from restructuring. So when you have a clause in a contract that limits collective action clauses, be careful. That's a red flag, right? Reject it. Blow the trumpet on that. And then, of course, the final one is erased transparency. You want opacity. You don't want public participation, right? The Chinese don't want the public to know that we're negotiating another loan with your country for the purposes of constructing underground whatever they want to do, right? That lack of transparency is what kills accountability in a nation, which then means you never know what fiscal crisis, be it solvency or insolvency, your country is going to be moving towards. So these are the key words that I found. Gamble. So it's easy to remember. It's something that many of you do. I'm sure you go and gamble in the casinos. If you do, don't do that. You're wasting your money. But think about every time you're looking into a contract, think of the word gamble. Use these principles to now go ahead and identify problematic clauses into your contract. And then going forward, okay, Jason already explained this, right? This is Africa. Majority of our debt is sitting towards the private sector. That's where we have private equity investments coming in, and private equity investments is definitely a problem of illicit financial flows. They're the ones who are going to route the money into tax havens, right? They're the ones who are going to route the money into financial secrecy jurisdictions so that you don't know that if, for example, I, as the Republic of Aphrodite, have entered into a contract with you, you can choose to now go ahead on the secondary market, sell that debt and not even tell me. So I don't even know who my true creditor is. These are part of the problems that we are seeing in Latin American countries. And then I did a bit of a comparative analysis of debt structures. I don't intend to give you a lecture on this because people at the back complain I talk too much. But you will have access to these slides, and you'll be able to compare, right, the different structures of loans that you get from the World Bank and IMF vis-a-vis Eurobonds, vis-a-vis Chinese. And you can already see Chinese are, in terms of transparency, the World Bank, IMF, they're publicly disclosed. You can access the World Bank and you can get access to the debt contract that they have signed with sovereign states. Eurobonds are private contracts, rarely disclosed, but then the Chinese loans are often secretive with confidentiality clauses. Okay? And that goes back to the political economy of the nation that's transacting with you. It's autocratic. It doesn't have human rights standards that it abides by. So by extension, it brings that into your laws as well. And then when you look at the debt sustainability issues, it's possible with the World Bank and IMF contracts to renegotiate your debt, to restructure it. Eurobonds, potentially yes, but there are no inbuilt relief mechanisms. But for the Chinese loans, debt renegotiation is possible, but it is ad hoc. So there's some good there. We need to go and dig a bit deeper what these ad hoc measures are, right? What more collateral do you have to offer? And then, of course, you'd see on debt and restructuring, China renegotiates on a case-by-case basis. They'll go to see where their long-term interests lie, and then they like to avoid large-scale write-offs. But under the Paris Club, you can be lucky to get a large-scale write-off like we've seen for other African nations. So learn the distinction between the way in which the legal structuring of these debt contracts are done under these particular creditors that we look towards. There's a lot more on transparency and conditionality. There is a lot more on debt and distress. And then the key takeaways is simple. There's this paper that we had done for Aphrodite on the legal foundations of debt. It gives you much more information on the critical issues surrounding debt contracts. If you have a chance to read it, I think it's only in English, so you can have a chance to read that going forward. Again, you'll have some of these slides here. I'm not going to read them. It just gives you more information on what you need to look out for in your debt contract. So we talked about the gamble part, which is the governing law. Think about the sovereign immunity waivers. At what point can a private creditor tell a nation that you will not be immune as a sovereign when I take you to court? Even the UN does not allow these clauses for employment contracts. So why would a state allow that? Right? Again, it's the market. It's what we talk about. Capital at risk. It's all about profit. Think about the CDCs. They're very important because one default on one clause triggers a default of the entire debt contract, and that could push a country into insolvency. I talked about collective action restrictions. This just gives you more information. Acceleration clauses, we talked about this. Those are our East African presidents. One of them is now another one. And then stabilization clauses, Yash talked about this, to maintain a bit of a moratorium on how you can change laws that may impact your currency, which in turn may impact your relationship with your creditor. So even the stabilization clauses is something we need to look forward to. This again is the escrow arrangements. You want the money, the creditor is coming and telling you, well, set up an escrow account because that's the only condition I need from you to be able to loan you money. That escrow account is going to empty your budget. You will not have the capacity to redistribute your own revenue to funding public services. That's how we get pushed into austerity. Creditor committee provisions. When you want to restructure, sometimes the creditors will say, set up a committee, and when you set up a committee, you have to pay for it. It becomes costly, right? So journalists, what's the purpose of all this discussion that we're having today? It's simple. Hold your governments accountable. Investigate debt, but as you're investigating debt, do not forget about the geopolitical lived reality of where we are at this moment, right? What's happening in New York is going to influence what's going to happen in the AFCA region, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Expose the legal traps in debt contracts. Look at the human impact of debt. And I liked what happened in the morning when we were given the example of the bottle of Coca-Cola in South African rand versus the same price of the Coca-Cola bottle in New York. And that fundamental difference can explain to you the kind of implosion you're going to have when you're borrowing in foreign currency. And of course, story angles. Have your own story angle for investigative reports. And I liked what the last group did to just come and summarize it for us as a journalist. So thank you very much.